Hello to all. I'm here today with a replay cast of the Tier 8 premium German aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin B. This replay was from yesterday, so still played on patch 0.9.10. Played on the map Warrior's Path in Domination. As you can see, this was a bottom tier game, so the Graf Zeppelin playing on 8 to 10 matchmaking. Now you can see, thanks to some quote-unquote new technology, we now are able to at the very least see the reticle of my planes on a replay. So we can now kind of cast from replay. Notably, you will see as I'm flying these rocket planes, however, that the indicator for my detectability range of planes and such has been removed for whatever reason. Ouija thinks that giving players information is a bad idea or something, so I'm not sure about that. Anyhow, starting off the match with the Graf Zeppelin's HE rockets. So the Graf Zeppelin obviously predates the release of the German carrier tech tree line, so she's a bit different from her counterparts. Now she has the same fragile planes. You can see this 8-plane squadron has a very low hit point pool with these tier 8 M155As. And more importantly, these M155s, unlike the Messerschmitts that you would find on the Percival, are much slower. Now each aircraft only launches 4 rockets, and it's a 2x4 squadron, so it's kind of like a Kaga squadron. However, unlike the Kaga, with its 28mm of penetration, it only has 40 millimeters of penetration and quite a bit more alpha. However, that you can see that even just the light AA of the Shimakaze and the Pommern there are able to shred those planes due to their fragile nature. Here in the black variant of the Graf Zeppelin, by the way, which is why my aircraft are skinned in black. Following up my initial scouting run, which was relatively unsuccessful thanks to that rather wide reticle and low amount of rockets launched. So following up with the torpedo bombers. Now if you noticed when I was boosting with the rocket planes, they boosted up to about 180 knots. Here you can see my torpedo bombers, on the other hand, cruising at 180 knots, diving down into an attack here on this low AA Vladivostok, and you can see them zooming up to that peak speed of 226 knots. Same standard consumables, although you will note, unlike the tech tree torpedo bombers, they do not have that third speed boost charge. Also, unlike the torpedo bombers, on the tech tree Parzival, the torpedoes are extremely slow. They only do 35 knots stock for the US torpedo acceleration. And they have very poor kind of aiming time. It takes a really long time for them to get into an accurate reticle. But the Graf Zeppelin kind of zooming her squadrons in and out, not giving me too much time to talk about individual squadrons. Relaunching here of my Die bombers, you can see that circular reticle that's unique to the Graf Zeppelin and the Erich Lowenhart. However, unlike the Lowenhart, you can see the reticle does not in fact shrink in size. It stays the same size throughout the dive, and you kind of get a really wonky dispersion pattern. You can see you can kind of flicker drop it. Before, when you could slingshot, this was very useful for being able to slingshot Graf Zeppelin bombers, but with the 8-second anti-slingshot timer, well, you can't really do that anymore. You can see me flicking the attack timer there just to duck out of the fighter once more. Now the bombs of the Graf Zeppelin did get nerfed over in the first AP dive bomber pass before the release of the German CVs. So it went from 7,000 damage per bomb to 5,800. So you get 5,800 alpha on 2 bombs per pass, with up to 4 passes on that fragile TA-152. So her aircraft carrying the bomb is extremely fast, but has low HP, as you can see here. So the dive bombers overall are not too reliable. You can see me here kind of fighting to turn with my torpedo bombers. Another thing that's different between the TA-152C carried on the Graf Zeppelin and, say, the TA-152 carried on the Tier 10 Manfred von Richthofen is that it doesn't turn very well. You can see that reticle widening just slightly. Trying to slam some torpedo hits, but it's quite a bit more challenging with those slow torpedoes than when compared to those on the Percival or the MVR. Coming in again, you can see that slow narrowing once more. Arming distance does remain quite short. But this overall slower speed, the 40 knots with torpedo acceleration, wow, that's a nice graphical interface. Ouija, Jesus Christ. The slow speed combined with relatively poor damage doesn't exactly make them a particularly potent anti-destroyer weapon. Now you do have those HE rockets, but the HE rockets are a bit unreliable. So again, taking out those dive bombers, I can't show you the alpha here because it's a replay, but it is that 5800 alpha. Looking for a target. Now just like the German bombers overall, they do have a significant amount of penetration, but this reticle does make aiming quite difficult. You will frequently, even with fully aimed bombs, only hit one bomb, in this case hitting two bombs, but they seldom double citadel. Again, that reset timer that prevents slingshots also preventing me from making a second attack there, and the low HP of the Graf Zeppelin squadron, getting those planes rather shredded. You can see me here leading on the torpedo bombers, being very selective as to where I spend them. They are extremely fast, and as I said, they have poor arming time and relatively middling damage. They do 5,333 damage per torpedo as opposed to the 4,500 or so on the Parseval. Same number of torpedoes in the same 3x3 squadron and roughly the same speed. The Graf Zeppelin's TA-152s are actually faster. However, they, as I mentioned, have very, very poor turning circles, so I need to make kind of wide, sweeping turns. And you want to arm as far away from AA as possible to prevent you from getting that debuff, which keeps you from arming, or rather, aiming in a rapid manner. 3 torpedoes, note I'm at 25,000 damage. And on a relatively poor torpedo protection, Palmern, we're going to jump from 25,000 to 36,000, so dealing about 11,000 over 3 torpedoes, bringing the planes about 5 aircraft of about 9,000 HP, putting each torpedo bomber at roughly 1,800 hit points. You can see that slow speed there, if I was playing the Parsifal, would have no trouble nailing the Zao with probably all 3, but they're only able to hit him with 2 as he maneuvers out of the way of those slow torpedoes. Not doing too much so far, but just playing fairly conservatively. Do note that I get spotted here quite early outside of the spotting range of most of the enemy ships if you're looking at the minimap. So I know at this point that there is that destroyer in my radius, probably the Kagero over here. So I am sweeping. If I don't find him though, I'm going to go onto the Palmern, but I do end up finding him. You can see here again that the universal reticle changes, pretty much nerfing the Graf Zeppelin, getting what I would consider to be a good drop there, hitting 4 out of 8 rockets. On a fairly not lined up drop here, slightly overshooting and only landing the 2 bombs, you can see each individual rocket does hit fairly hard, just like kind of like a miniature Tiny Tim with that 40mm penetration and 5,400 alpha, but it's very hard to get consistent, reliable damage, so even though you have pretty good potential alpha, you don't end up being able to deal that well with many targets, especially destroyers with those rockets. Kagero remains spotted, but I think at this point I'm going for the Riga. It's either that or the FDG, but I believe the FDG is under quite heavy fire, so I'm gonna spend my planes and harass the Riga instead. Now he does turn in, which makes it a bit difficult. My slow torpedoes with that triple convergence does mean that he is going to short the central torpedo and dodge the other 2. A bit tragic, but that does happen. But I can see he's going to beach, so I just can quite easily bring them in. Fragile nature of the planes, meaning that even just the 4 aircraft, they're falling to relatively light AA, and 1 more aircraft dies on the way up. You can see over here, only 2 torpedo bombers making it back. Flood chance on the German torpedoes is fairly poor, although this is a relative statement. You can see I am hard spotted by the Yamato, thankfully for me for now at the very least. He's not really shooting at me, which means I am going to be able to dive through all of this heavy flak, just bringing the full squadron of armor-piercing dive bombers. I'm technically not actually guaranteed a hit here. The bomb's thankfully actually sliding centrally to give me a more consistent drop in this case. The twin nature of the Graf Zeppelin, along with the tendency of AP bombs to kind of go onto either side of the center of the reticle, means that it is actually quite hard to hit centerline targets. Yamato's still insisting on shooting me, and you can see the large ejectability of my hull, getting me quite spotted. He's moving fairly slowly, however, so even with my slow-moving torpedoes, it's quite easy to line up a triple drop here. So we're going to get a good amount of damage onto him. I did pop my heal here because this Yamato is fairly isolated, so I anticipate that I should be able to get 3 drops onto him. Fighting through that AA debuff, you can see it's actually almost difficult, almost don't get that proper lineup on that last set of torpedoes. Put another 3 into him for another 7k or so. The Yamato, of course, has that 55% torpedo bulge. His AA does finally manage to clip, but even just 1 torpedo here should be sufficient to finish him off, along with that flooding. He does finally fire. Thankfully, the Graf Zeppelin does not have exposed citadels, so just the 1 gun only manages to shave off 10,000 points of health. Points remain fairly even, but you can see my team is behind on caps at this point. I've been forced to kind of hover at the back because of the way the enemy formation has pushed through. Now, thankfully, on Warrior's Path, there is a fair bit of cover here at the center, but it's going to be quite dangerous. Operating once more with my rockets, really haven't been using them that much. They're not poor versus light targets. Oh, a bit of an overshoot there, but I do manage to nail the Kagero nevertheless with 5 out of 8 rockets. So pretty good dispersion there again. Honestly, an above average roll. Don't quite manage to finish him off, leaving him at 79 health, so I am going to have to fly back for him, but at least someone does help finish off the Cleveland over there. So I should be able to move forward unmolested. Now I did see that Kagero, so I do have to be wary of torpedoes, though he's likely to have dumped them toward one of the battleships pushing the corner, but at this point, with my still quite well conserved torpedo bombers, which I've been using very selectively on only targets that are fairly light in AA, really only suiciding my dive bombers and rocket planes, because you have to understand that the Graf Zeppelin only really has 1 squadron to work with, and these are these torpedo bombers. This is the one reliable squadron. Vladivostok, of course, a notoriously poor AA tier 8, so able to harass him quite readily. Putting 3 torpedoes in him at first. Parzival is harassing me, but as I mentioned, the Graf Zeppelin's citadel is quite hidden. Do manage to land 2 more torpedoes, and we're going to follow up with the ABDBs. With the ABDBs, when you bring 6 to 8 aircraft, you're really looking to make only 1 attack. Just zoom in at full speed, make that 1 pass, and then more than likely you're just going to F out. Versus a lighter AA target that has had some of its AA strips, such as this Vladivostok, you might be able to make a 2nd pass, but it really does vary. In this case, I would have been able to. You can see there that pretty much perfectly lined up pass, lined up exactly the same as the rest of the passes this game, but no citadel, just the bomb decided to glance onto a piece of armor that was not protecting citadel plates, so no citadel. Bringing the bombers down into the bottom of the drop, just harassing this Akazuki, but really I'm probably going to have to reach for rockets after this, just really here to spot in case anyone has a shot, but you can see no one outside of my Hindenburg has a shot really, and I think the Hindenburg's a little busy getting harassed by the Parzival. Now, one of the frequent things that you see with the Graf Zeppelin is that people meme that it's a bit of cruiser, and indeed I do have the secondary build spec'd onto it. You can reach a maximum range of 9.4 kilometers of secondary range, but as you can see, I've basically fired my secondaries 0 times. You're not going to see me make use of it. Pushing my hull, however, in towards C, I know the Akazuki's there and he's going to threaten that cap, so I can at the very least use those secondaries to attack this target here, but As far as secondary meme ships go, well, the Graf Zeppelin as a carrier is not really going to have too many opportunities to make use of it. Only 2 rockets landing there. Now the reticle does look like it's a bit over the Akazuki, but I think that's an artifact of the replay. Now the Messerschmitt 155s are extremely slow, especially for a German aircraft with no HP, but one of the side effects of that is that they do maneuver extremely well. And at low speed maneuvering, you can make some very tight turns, able to put out some surprisingly accurate hits there, but do keep in mind the Akazuki is not resisting at all. He does eventually smoke up underneath the cover of my fighter, but I'm quite confident I can try and push him out, pushing him with my hull now at this point. And I have a fighter over his smoke, so I'll know if he leaves, and I'm gonna just try to blind hit him with the torpedo bombers. So you can see each time I pass over that target area, it takes me a long time to get back over because the turning circle of the aircraft is relatively poor. The TA-152s, unlike the Messerschmitt rocket planes, are suited for traveling in straight lines and pretty much straight lines only. Parseval on the enemy team is going to light me up briefly for the Akazuki, so he's going to be able to shoot me, but at 42,000 health, even with the Akazuki's relatively formidable DPM, I'm not overly concerned. I am going to maneuver my hull somewhat, since I am going to be briefly spotted, but as those Parseval planes pass behind that mountain, they are going to go invisible. My Minnesota does end up blind firing him, but my slight maneuver does take me out of the way of those Akazuki torps, and I will be able to retake this cap. My AA is going off. You can see me quite quickly shredding those rocket planes. Graf Zeppelin hull, like all Tier 8 carrier hulls, does have relatively substantial anti-aircraft armament. Fairly pedestrian Graf Zeppelin game here, nothing particularly special in terms of what I've done, although you can see over the course of this particular match, I have racked up a substantial amount of damage at 157. Right now you can see that compared to the number of rockets I fire per pass, 8 rockets per pass versus 3 torpedoes per pass, I've done a lot more leading on my torpedoes than anything else, only 8 bombs actually impacting a target and 21 rockets actually impacting a target. I'm looking for the carrier. I checked his initial position, but seeing that where that dive bomber was coming from, I wasn't paying enough attention earlier, so I had to waste some time. I did realize that the Augustus Percival is in the north. So I'm just bringing my hull around, gonna go toward B, in case the Percival has decided to maybe attempt to put his hull into B. You can see we're still slightly down on points, in spite of having regained the cap lead. With the 4 planes that are left in my squadron after pre-dropping, I do end up finding the Parseval. Now I don't have a fighter consumable, so I'm not able to keep him lit up that way, but 4 planes is a perfect amount to let his AA chew through 1, and then the high speed of the bombers should take me through. You can see the low travel speed of the torpedoes of only 40 knots of speed does mean I have to give a substantial amount of lead to end up getting a nice 3 torpedo hit, however. Again, pre-dropping on the way in, and this time I think I'm going to end up using my heel, so I'm probably going to drop down to just the 3 aircraft. Now my Minnesota's about to round the corner, so it'd be nice if I could keep spotting for him, but in this situation I'm only interested in dealing damage for myself. Now if this was a competitive setting, I would probably consider at least hovering over him until my Minnesota could fire a salvo, but this is a random battle, so I'm just going to dive right onto the target, again giving fairly substantial lead before dumping the torpedoes into the water. I'm anticipating he might turn toward the border to dodge, so that's why I'm leading in such a manner. So I might end up only hitting 1 or 2, but in this case I did end up hitting 3. And I'm just repeatedly attacking him with those torpedo bombers at 227 knots of speed, allowing me to cross the map space quite efficiently. That is, of course, one of the key strengths of German aircraft carriers in general, the Graf Zeppelin being no exception. Four aircraft again, which means I should be able to dive, conserving my boost at the end here. I am now out of engine cooling consumables. So I do need to make sure I conserve that last bit of speed boost. He appears to have stopped moving, so I do lead quite a bit less. And at this point, the game's about to tick out. We do just barely manage to make it past that finish line marker. So this strike force is not going to be able to make it in, but we are going to finish at a nice, hefty 70 or so point lead to wrap up this replay match. Now this was a replay, as I said, but thankfully we have this to work with. Did save some screenshots, so it does end up being a victory. As you can see, we did win by time expiration. We were up points, and I ended up making 900,000 credits, gross credit on a premium account. So 194,000 damage, 32 torpedo hits, 8 bomb hits, 14 fighters, 6 incapacitations, 2 kills, 4 fires, 8 floods, 3 citadels, 5 defender ribbons, 1 assisted capture, 15 spotting ribbons. Kind of goes to show how the Gunther Luchen's legendary captain can be helpful in that regard. 21 rocket hits and 1 plane shot down by fighter for a high caliber and Confederate. Moving up to the team score wise, you can see being bottom tier and attacking high tier ships, especially the substantial amount of destroyer damage that we ended up doing over the course of the match, does allow you to reach quite high base experiences sitting at 3,200, quite comfortably first place above the next highest on my team at 2,400. Moving over to the detailed report, this is kind of what I wanted to talk about. So we did end up dealing 194,000 damage over the course of the match. However, if you look at the distribution of where that damage came from, you can see our AP bombs did a middling 23,000, our rockets did a rather more substantial 25,000, and our torpedoes did the bulk of the legwork, dealing 120,000 torpedo alpha and inflicting 23,000 flood damage. Now you can't see all of the ships I dealt damage to here, but you'll note that there's a substantial amount of damage onto the Kagero, and I think there ends up being another 10,000 on the Akazuki and another 6,000 on the Shimakaze. So that's where the bulk of our experience came from. But my point in showing you this is to show you that the torpedo bombers pull the most weight on this squadron. The other 2 squadrons are not particularly useful, so if you end up in a situation where your torpedo bomber squadron gets shredded, you can be very difficult to find success in the Graf Zeppelin, whereas if you play the Augustus von Parseval in the tech tree, that carrier, in spite of being somewhat less flexible thanks to having AP rockets, AP bombs, and torpedoes, can end up leaning on her bombs quite a bit more effectively when they are effective. And last but not least, of course, the credit earnings. 9,000 gross, and then servicing costs bring us to 8,670, or 867,000 credits, rather. Now, as this is a replay, you're going to have to give me a moment to reopen up the client now, so you're going to experience some momentary disconcertion, I assume. So we're going to let the client fire up. I think OBS should still be hovering on the detailed scorecard. So note that I did lose 59 aircraft over the course of the match. And this is a substantial amount of the Graf Zeppelin's hangar. The Graf Zeppelin is not particularly notable for its hangar size. It has a fairly middling hangar size overall and kind of poor regeneration speeds. I think I'm actually going to end up... I need to use my other account. This is my alt. So I'm going to have to reopen the World of Warships client, so you'll have to excuse me and can bear with me as we troubleshoot and reopen the World of Warships client. So I was leading mostly on the torpedo bombers, but at the end of the game I still was able to field mostly full squadrons thanks to being fairly conservative. You saw me pre-dropping quite a bit. These days I don't pre-drop that much in most of my tier 8 carriers, especially with torpedo bombers that have access to that heal, but the Graf Zeppelin is a carrier where you're going to find yourself pre-dropping more than normal thanks to that kind of fragile HP pool and also poor regeneration time, especially on those torpedo bombers that are going to be dealing the majority of your damage. As I did mention the Graf Zeppelin can be secondary spec, but as you saw, you're going to be playing your most successful games, you're probably going to be playing as a carrier. Now, some of the most memorable games, I'm sure, will end up being played as a secondary cruiser. But don't forget that the Graf Zeppelin is in the end an aircraft carrier, and aircraft are how you're going to accumulate the vast majority of your damage. So even with the significant amount of specification into being a secondary carrier, don't get caught up in the meme hype. The planes, even although they're quite poor, can still do their job quite sufficiently. Alright, client is finally fired up, so I can hook us back up with some World of Warships client. Just going to hide this for now. And hopefully, let me just double check that this is functioning. Looks like we are capturing screen now. So this is my Graf Zeppelin. Don't need to know about that. So the Graf Zeppelin B with a 19-point captain. This was the captain that we played that game with. So first off, I mentioned our durability. So remember, the Graf Zeppelin can be played as a secondary cruiser somewhat, but she's not particularly exceptional in terms of armor. 21mm plate means that any battleship will easily overmatch all parts of your hull. And only low tier 14-inch gun, or so that's 350th and lesser, 14-inch AP will bounce off your deck of 25, and 25mm deck means most high explosive, and pretty much all bombs and rockets will also penetrate your hull. Now, Parzival did harass me somewhat with AP bombs and rockets, but you will note that the Graf Zeppelin's citadel is basically underwater. There's no turtleback, and the sides are 20mm, however, so battleships will be able to citadel you, but the upper roof plate is 40mm. So as long as you're not in the middle of a turn, they shouldn't be able to inflict huge amounts of citadel damage to you all at once, but don't think that you have any turtleback or anything, really. You have this soft turtleback, but it's only 60mm of plate, so it's not as substantial as the one that you find on the Parzival, which kind of keeps her from getting citadels. Similar in shape, you can see on the Parzival, but I believe the Parzival has somewhat thicker plating. Yeah, 80mm here. From the looks of it, it's hard for me to get the right angle. $100mm belt, and I think it's 80. I can't be confident and tell you that's 80. Well, it might be the same 60 actually, but nevertheless, squishy carrier, relatively protected citadel, but do not expose yourself. Hit point pool in terms of raw HP, 55,000 and 16% torpedo bulge, so you do have some protection against enemy carriers. In terms of bulge protection, but you're certainly going to take bomb damage and such, so try not to get yourself into too much of a scrap. Now, more importantly, the Graf Zeppelin's aircraft. This is the bread and butter of any aircraft carrier, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise whether that carrier is the Graf Zeppelin or not. So the attack aircraft, as I mentioned, the Me-155, extremely low HP at 1500, about the same as the Kaga, and only able to reach up to 180 knots at maximum boost and cruising at a very slow 139. Each aircraft does carry 4 rockets, and each rocket has an alpha damage of 4,450, which puts you at roughly 1,100 damage per rocket. Please stop zipping away from the aircraft, game client. Those rockets have 40mm of penetration, so it's kind of in between the Tiny Tim and the Havar. Havar with 33 mils, and I believe 2800 alpha. Actually, it might be even less than that. It might be like around 2500, 2300. Whereas this rocket has 40 mils of penetration, which actually is a relevant penetration bracket. It doesn't break 50, which is the kind of universal armor-piercing bracket that you get on American rockets of the Tiny Tims and American bombs, but is a good amount of armor penetration battleships such as the Vladivostok and such that you might find at this tier. I believe are covered in 40mm plate. Let me just double check for a second. So if you look here, a battleship like the Vladivostok, which is actually fairly well armored against most carrier rockets at this tier has 40mm deck, which shatters most HE, 50 on the back, but 40 on the front, and 32 on the nose, of course. So you can penetrate the Vladivostok, which is something a lot of ships can't do at this tier. But of course, if you're bottom tier, once you move up to higher tier, German and Russian ships, you get this uniform 16mm deck on, say, the Soyuz, or say a Grosser Kurfürst, with these 50mm strakes, which does mean the Graf Zeppelin's rockets are relatively less effectual and kind of on par with other 32mm beating rockets in tier 10 and 9 matchmaking. Nevertheless, a fairly effective rocket. It's mostly held back by the fact that the aircraft is extremely slow and it shoots very few rockets. That 2x4 squadron, generally you're not going to get 4 attacks out of it ever, even versus very low AA targets thanks to that low HP pool. Even making 2 attacks on a target tends to be kind of difficult. 26% fire chance is also fairly substantial on those rocket planes, but it kind of really depends as to whether or not you're going to be able to get that second attack. Overall, the low HP and low speed does allow you to make very, very tight turns, which allows you to stay on destroyers, as you saw me use in that last game just now there. But it's not a particularly good rocket plane overall, and it's a kind of last resort weapon. You use it versus destroyers, of course, and a scout, but outside of setting a follow-up fire, it's not a reliable tool. Unlike Tiny Tims in the past, before they were nerfed, of course, where they could be used very reliably to finish off targets and set fires, these rockets are slow and fragile, and versus a heavy AA target that's going to put up a lot of flak, you might never get to the target, even with a full squadron, thanks to that low speed and low HP. There's only 14 of them on deck, and they have a 71-second regeneration time, so even though they're, in my opinion, substantially worse than the rocket planes found on the Shokaku, which have lesser penetration, but significantly less regeneration time if you look here. Roughly the same HP, but much faster cruising speed at 151 versus 139, maximum speed at 191 versus 180, and a regeneration time of 60 seconds versus that 71. So Graf Zeppelin showing off her rather poor rocket planes. Torpedo bombers, on the other hand, are good. Now, you might think that I would be saying that they are excellent, seeing as they are the main squadron and I did 120,000 damage with them, but they are not actually that good, which is one of the Graf Zeppelin's major issues. She doesn't actually have an excellent squadron. She does in fact have a good squadron, a mediocre squadron, and a pretty terrible squadron overall, which is one of the problems with the Graf Zeppelin as a complete package. So 2,500 or 2,053 HP each, cruising at a good speed of 186 knots, kind of the Graf Zeppelin classic for super fast planes, and 227 knot maximum speed. Unlisted, here is the turning circle of the planes. What you need to know about both the dive bombers and torpedo bombers on the TA-152 is that they are extremely sluggish. They turn extremely poorly, so they need to attack in a certain way. You need to line up an attack, make a straight run boosting to full speed, and kind of dump the payload into the water. And unlike most carriers where you might want to turn in to try and make a second attack, you want to continue straight forward and shoot all the way out of the AA bubble. If your squadron has enough HP after coming out, then you want to make your large turn outside of AA influence, come back in, realign your vector, and make a second attack that way. That is one of the limitations of the Graf Zeppelin, kind of this, you're forced to take on this boom and zoom through attack style, which does limit the overall utility. Now this 3x3 squadron has 9 planes total, each dropping 1 torpedo when in an attack pass, so 3 planes per attack pass with 1 torpedo each, so roughly a 15,000 attack wave alpha, since each torpedo hits here, as you can see, for 5,300. It's not a particularly heavy warhead, and even with torpedo acceleration, it only does 40 knots, unlike the Augustus von Parzival, which this one has no upgrades whatsoever, with just the module doing 52 knots. Actually, I think this carrier doesn't even have the modules, if I recall. Yeah, I don't have anything spec'd onto my Parzival. So you can see the torpedoes are substantially slower than those tech tree carriers, torpedo bombers, which makes it quite a bit less effective. It does do a bit more damage at 5300, but it's not enough to make a difference. Flood chance is also fairly poor, and the aiming speed, unlike the fast aiming German Augustus von Parzival torpedoes, is also poor, as you saw throughout that game. You carry 16 aircraft on deck with this build, and each torpedo bomber has a restoration time of 72 seconds, which is not terrible, but it's not great. And last but not least, you have those dive bombers. Now I'm not buffing any HP on these dive bombers so that you can see they're quite fragile at 1850. They do have that same high cruising speed of 186 knots and max speed of 227. However, each of them in that 2x4 squadron, unlike the superior 3x3 setup of the torpedo bombers, you only drop 2 bombs per pass, and each bomb hits for a very underwhelming 5800. I will just briefly remind you that the nerfed Ryujo dive bomber hits for roughly the same. I think it's 5,000 each, 5,100. So you're barely hitting for more than a Ryujo bomb effectively on a carrier quite a bit higher in tier. And again, like that Ryujo, you're dropping 2 bombs per pass, so the alpha ends up being just over 10,000 here. However, unlike the Ryujo, it's fairly reliable Japanese AP dive bomber reticle. The Graf Zeppelin's circular reticle, even though it allows you to attack from any angle, is extremely unreliable. The bombs kind of shoot wherever they want within the reticle, and unlike the Lowenhardt, the more modern German carrier premium, this reticle does not, in fact, shrink over time, which means that you don't get any precise pinpoint aim. Instead, it's just a relatively angle agnostic reticle that is, well, difficult to use. As a result, people tend to kind of write off the Graf Zeppelin dive bombers. They really tend not to perform that well. It's a game of RNG at best. And with 14 aircraft on board and 83-second regeneration time, well, these planes are not going to be doing you any favors in a longer game. Module-wise, the Graf Zeppelin will differ slightly compared to most carriers. First 2 slots are still the obvious 2 carrier upgrades. However, slot 3, if you're committing to that secondary build, you want to take secondary battery. Now on the Parzival, I take attack aircraft mod 1, but if you were to say I don't care about secondaries at all, you would probably end up taking torpedo speed here. Now taking torpedo speed does increase the arming distance of your torpedoes, but the Graf Zeppelin's default arming distance, arming distance gets increased as well as long with your speed. However, since you're usually only attacking heavy targets anyway with your Graf Zeppelin torpedoes, that increased arming distance doesn't tend to matter. You're not using them to hunt destroyers, unlike on the Parzival, so it's much less impactful. You have HE rockets after all. However, I am taking a secondary battery module to extend the firing range and to decrease the dispersion. Torpedoes bomber in slot 4, torpedo bombers modification 2. Now usually most carriers with torpedo bombers will end up taking bomber HP because torpedo bombers have access to this heal consumable, the repair consumable. That lets them tank more than they usually would, so you put the extra HP onto the dive bombers, which don't have a heal and have to go right over the target. However, as I mentioned, the Graf Zeppelin has extremely poor dive bombers, relatively speaking, and really the only reliable source of damage are the torpedo bombers, so you're going to be ideally using them as much as possible. So I just want to make them as tanky as possible since they're the best squadron, so that's where I choose to put my HP there. And finally, in slot 5, it's tempting to actually take Concealment Expert, especially because the Graf Zeppelin has horrific concealment. So this is with Concealment module on my Captain, and I'm still at 14.1 kilometer concealment. And if, for those of you who are not in the know, 14.1 puts you as by far the worst in terms of concealment. A concealment build midway says at 13.8. And the tier 10 Manfred von Richthofen, which you might think would have poor concealment, actually sits at 12.2, almost 2 full kilometers less detection than the Graf Zeppelin. However, as I mentioned, the Graf Zeppelin has extremely poor regeneration times and not very large deck space. Without this, you end up with a 12-14-12 setup as opposed to the 14-16-14 setup. And as you saw in that tier 10 game, I was kind of running out of planes toward the end of that match, which did go the full stretch. So my recommendation is to take Flight Control Module in spite of that poor detection. If you prefer to be slightly more stealthy, however, taking Concealment Module is an option. Moving on to my captain build. This is my 19-point Graf Zeppelin captain. You can ignore the part where it says Scharnhorst B. I just grabbed a captain that has never been on a tech tree ship. So if you'll look here, this is the basic 9 points that you see on any carrier with slow torpedoes. I recommend taking these 9 points first. So that's servicing time, air supremacy, aircraft armor, and survivability expert. Now if you're leaning in toward that secondary build on the Graf Zeppelin, getting that maximum range with that improved secondary dispersion, you do want your AFT, but I do recommend stopping for plane speed first. So do your 11 points of I am playing as an actual aircraft carrier stuff first. So make sure you take your surfacing time, torpedo acceleration, armor, and survivability expert, and then get your plane speed. Then you can follow up with advanced firing training. Do note, however, if you don't take concealment expert first, instead of having 14.1 kilometers of concealment, I believe you start out with 15.3, so you are going to get shot at a lot. Let me tell you, prior to having concealment expert on this captain, I basically had to run concealment module on the hull because 15.3 was nigh on unworkable. There would be games where you would spawn in and you would be spotted maybe 30 seconds into the match, and then some tier 10 battleship would blap you from across the map. And as I mentioned, you don't have any armor, you're not an armored carrier, you're not British. So if you're going secondary memes, take AFT first, but just be warned, you're going to need to find some cover real fast. So once you have your AFT, follow up with Concealment Expert because, as I mentioned, you really need to improve that concealment. Now the Graf Zeppelin does have the best secondary dispersion formula in the game. They are extremely accurate, and they are made up of 105s and 150s. Now these are German secondaries, so they do have 1/4 HE pen. So the 150s naturally have roughly, I believe, what does it end up being, like 37, I think it's 37 millimeters of penetration, and the 105s have just about 26. So the 105s won't be able to pen battleships, but these 150s on the bottom of the ship, the 6-inch guns, will. Do note that the secondaries are asymmetrical. You have the 105s only on one side of the ship, so the Graf Zeppelin secondaries are actually most formidable on the starboard side. These can fire across the deck, but I believe the firing angles are a lot worse on this side, so you need to kind of be like full broadside to get these 105s to fire. Whereas if you're having this side attack the ship, kind of leaning your target over here in the distance toward this lighthouse and sailboat, the 105s have a lot better firing arcs. So the Graf Zeppelin does actually care about which side you're facing the enemy with. Now it is a very formidable battery. It has improved secondary dispersion, so very formidable anti-destroyer setup. That does not even require manual secondaries, really. They are supremely accurate. Fully spec'd out, they reach a range of 9.4 kilometers. So quite respectable. HE damage is obviously not spectacular. But the fire chance is actually quite respectable. Now you can spec into IFHE if you want your 105s to be able to penetrate battleship plating. However, this does halve the fire chance. And more importantly, it does mean you're going to need to take another 4-pointer, which probably means you won't be able to take Concealment Expert. If you don't take Concealment Expert, you're probably going to have to end up taking Concealment Module. So if you really want to go into that full IFHE Graf Zeppelin meme build, just make sure you switch this out for Concealment, because playing with 15-kilometer detection is not easy at all, and you're really just going to be sending yourself to the bottom far earlier than you otherwise would need to. Now overall, you will note that I have the Graf Zeppelin B and not the Graf Zeppelin. I purchased this during the Black Friday discount sales last year, and I've been playing it a substantial amount since. I do tend to go through all the carriers every once in a while and get a good feel for them. Now sadly, the Graf Zeppelin, as far as tier 8 premiums go, is not exactly a great buy. Probably the weakest carrier at tier 8 by far. She has suffered a whole bunch from both rocket reticle changes and as well as AP dive bomber nerfs, which reduced her AP dive bomber damage. Her AP dive bombers also received a nerf pretty early on in their lifespan, which reduced their reliability and made them less likely to citadel, and they have some wonky behavior. And then the rocket reticle change made her fairly good rockets, which were carried on a bad aircraft, become fairly bad rockets carried on a fairly bad aircraft. And torpedoes have been untouched relatively. They actually used to do more damage, but they also received a nerf early on in their life cycle. That was before my time, of course, but the Graf Zeppelin really has just been receiving a string after string of buffs, or nerfs, sorry, and has never really received any compensatory buffs, and as a result is in a bit of a sorry state. So unfortunately, I cannot recommend the Graf Zeppelin to anyone who's looking for a serious carrier. If you're looking for a German carrier trainer, the Erich von Lohenhardt at tier 6 is by far more effective. The Lohenhardt has some rather marked weaknesses compared to the Graf Zeppelin, in that is a tier 6. It has kind of relatively harsh tier 6 matchmaking, but overall its qualities as an aircraft carrier are much better. It actually has 3 functional squadrons, unlike the Graf Zeppelin, which kind of has 1 actual squadron and then about 3/4 of another squadron and maybe half of a squadron. So between the 3 squadrons she has on board, she actually has roughly 2.25 squadrons, which is not a great outlook for a tier 8 carrier commanding a price tag in the range of, I believe, around 40 to 45 American dollars. Now she does look great in this slick black and chrome, which is kind of one of the reasons I have it, just to have all the carriers as a bit of a carrier main, and because I think she looks cool, but overall I cannot recommend her as a purchase. She is an extremely weak ship, and even though you saw me eviscerate those people in that replay that we went through just now, she is extremely limited when you get games where you bump into a Howland or you bump into a Friesland and a Flak Puff destroys your squadron, which can happen even to an experienced player. You're just going to have a rough game because the rest of your squadrons are kind of trash. So yeah, that's the sad reality of the Graf Zeppelin. She's actually quite fun to play because the extremely fast aircraft are just fun to zoom around the map in, but honestly, you can get most of that experience from just playing the Augustus von Parzival. You'll note that I have 0 experience on the Parzival on this particular account, but I have actually played the Parzival on my alternate account, and I do have the MVR on this account. Oh, and before I go, if you have Günther Luchens, his plane skills are actually quite nice. You get the extended boost, although with the Graf Zeppelin build, which has to take extra 4-pointers, you might not have room for it in your build. Although you could easily just take this build, ignore torpedo acceleration, accept that you're never going to hit anything remotely fast at all, and shift this over to AFT. I'm taking aiming systems. As you can see, this is my clan battles, Manfred, and you're definitely not doing any secondary memeage, really, in clan battles, so just taking the 4 points into sight stabilization. But anyway, he has this passive improvement on improved engine boost, which is obviously useful for an aircraft carrier captain, but more importantly, he has the air superiority talent, which means that after earning 30 ribbons with your aircraft, so that's bomb hits, rocket hits, or torpedo hits, which is fairly easy for a ship like the Manfred, and not easy, but not difficult for a carrier like the Graf Zeppelin. You get reduced surfacing time. As well, after spotting, after earning 3 spotting ribbons, you'll get a bit of an HP regeneration, which can be quite interesting in a carrier like the Graf Zeppelin, which might get into close range and scrap, and as a result take some damage. This will allow you to kind of heal somewhat, which is An interesting mechanic. So if you're not using your Gunther Luechen's legendary captain somewhere else, he is actually a fairly good German carrier captain and therefore Graf Zeppelin captain. With all that out of the way, that was our Graf Zeppelin review for Black Friday 1 year later. She's, I didn't think I would be saying this, but she's in an even worse state than she was a year ago, which is not a great perspective, but she is still extremely fun. So, buyer beware, you have been forewarned. Good looking and fun, but not particularly effective. That's the Graf Zeppelin. Hope you enjoyed, and catch you all later. Cheers.